Hey everyone, it's the Oxley Bomb MotoGP podcast with me, Matt Oxley, old racer, old journalist, and Peter Bomb, World Championship winning crew chief. So what are we talking about this week? We got quite a special episode this week. A few weeks ago, Peter and I were invited to Öhlins to visit their race department in Sweden, just north of Stockholm, and where they've always been. And so we went there with a few other journalists and got a look around. First time they ever allowed journalists into their race department. Obviously, much of it super secret. So we didn't get to see everything, but we saw a lot of really interesting stuff. And they explained and showed us also this top secret rear shock that only the factory Ducati team has been using since the start of last year with this stroke limiting device to help them use their ride height device better. No, it was a really interesting, super interesting visit. It really was. Enjoyed it a lot. And, we got to really talk about suspension. So, before we start, what does suspension do on a MotoGP bike? Basically two jobs. The first is to generate grip, to generate the forces in the tires to get them to work. And to make sure that the bike always tracks the asphalt, because if the bike tracks the asphalt correctly, you'll get more grip. The second sort of job that suspension does is to control the attitude of the bike, to get the geometry you need the bike to turn and so on. So, it's all about getting the pitch right on the way in, the pitch right on the way back. So it pitches forward on the brakes and into the corner, pitches back onto the rear out of the corner. So it's all about that. So that's what suspension technicians are working on with the teams. They're just trying to get the bike to grip the track properly, so it steers, so it turns properly, and they're trying to get it to so it's always in the correct attitude, diving into corners and coming out, and also to create stability. So we're doing this pod as a video as well. So because we got lots of pictures that we took while we were at Öhlins. So the idea is we're going to. You don't have to listen to this. Watch it on YouTube. But I think you'll enjoy it more if you do, because you'll sort of see what we're talking about as well as hear us talk about it. Because there's some cool photos of all the various trick stuff that we saw at Öhlins. So we're going to start off. The first picture is you'll see if you are watching is I think I took that one actually outside Öhlins when we turned up. So they kind of really made their HQ quite a bit bigger about 10 years ago, I think. It's a very impressive place. And obviously, significantly from a corporate point of view, Öhlins were bought by Brembo last year, and the idea of Brembo is to sort of, to create synergy between brake and suspension systems. They also own Marchesini wheels, so they're pretty much on their way to making a whole MotoGP bike. So Peter is obviously a lot more technical than I am. I kind of understood most stuff that we saw in the race department. Peter obviously understands more than I do. What did you make of the visit in general, just before we get into the nitty gritty?
I loved it. It is more or less as I expected it, but then still it's nice to see these super high quality material and have it in your hands, these shocks, these forks, and the more you start to realize again, a shock and a fork, you take it for granted and you know more or less what you know, and that's it. But then when you're in this company and in the racing department, then you start to automatically think a little bit deeper what it actually does and how they are making it. And it made me appreciate the job of and the quality of this product so much more. Öhlins is obviously a long name and so on and so on. So what I liked in that company is the combination of the experience, the history. This company's been around forever. They've always been on the leading edge of shock and suspension and damping systems. But at the same time, most of the people are extremely passionate about it. It was not a routine thing that the journalists came to see the factory and they didn't do the general talk and then went off and have a coffee. They were a little bit nervous, but depending on the type of questions they got from us, these guys are super enthusiastic. They love the racing. They love it too bad. So they love technology. They love the racing a lot, and this company's been around for a long time. And these are three important things that I picked up again when I was at Öhlins.
Yeah. I mean, the company was started by Kent Öhlins back in the late 70s as a motocross. That was all they did for the first few years. They won the first motocross world championship in 1978, and they kind of moved into road racing in 1983. I think the first road racer to win a world championship on with Öhlins suspension was Carlos Lovato, or Careless Bravado, as we used to call him. Careless Bravado. I love Carlos Lovato. He's such a cool guy. He won the 1983 250 World Championship with Öhlins when he was riding for factory Yamaha 250s. And funny enough, that year they started working with King Kenny Roberts in the 500 class. And Roberts was just astonished how the bike just completely changed. That he'd had all these problems and he would be trying to explain them, King Kenny, very technical, explain them to the sort of Yamaha suspension engineers. I guess they probably used Showa or one of the Japanese OE manufacturers. And once they went to kind of Öhlins, he could say, I need it to top out there, or it's topping out too soon there. And I need a little bit less high compression rebound at the top of the fork or whatever, all that kind of stuff. He really, and suddenly they knew and could give him what he wanted. That was a massive part. I think they started middle of working with them, I think maybe in the middle of 1983. That was the year that Roberts had that massive battle for the title with Freddie Spencer and in Roberts' last season. I think if he'd started working with Öhlins at the beginning of that season, he might well have won the championship, because it went down like 2 points.
Looking back, there is always a lot of ifs, and looking back at the time you just described, I was thinking, shit, if I would go back in time with the knowledge we have now and live in that time, I would be a multi-millionaire and super famous, because with all we know, it was a beautiful time, because at that time, in a couple of months or in 2 years, there were some big discoveries done and big changes in the material and the way you approach a bike and what a bike actually does and where the suspension can help and where not, and how much you can transform a bike by just putting in another fork spring, and suddenly the rear tire has better grip and so on. I mean, all these things were completely alien to everybody at that time. So it must have been a super interesting time. I mean, suspension naming is extremely important, but now we're looking at 20 digits after the comma. And at that time, it was we changed the whole construction overnight. So that was beautiful. Interesting also, Matt, History Channel engaged. At the time of Öhlins, at that time, there were two suspension manufacturers that started and made a big name and still exist. And the Dutch had the WP, also starting in motocross, and Öhlins was there in Sweden. And they were fighting each other with everything they can, especially in motocross. They put everything in there. Road racing, WP was there. Factory Aprilias, Max Biaggi, the 125 Derbies. I think even in the time of Gigi, there was WP suspension in it. By the way, it was called VP because the springs were white. And then it's the original founder of the company said, that's a good name. So I call them White Power, my suspension. Well, at some point in history, they needed to, especially when they went to America, they had the big trucks, White Power. A lot of people were very enthusiastic to see the trucks, and the guys behind the steering wheel didn't understand it completely. That's how they changed the name.
Moving swiftly on.
And these two are still there. And obviously, Öhlins has been once bought by Yamaha, and Öhlins bought themselves back, and now it's WP went over into KTM. Still, there is the WP name as a manufacturer, and under WP they also make radiators and others, but they still make suspension for all the KTMs. There is WP upgrade kits you can buy us, I think also for other bikes, or it used to be also for other bikes. And in MotoGP, again, they are with some really high-tech stuff themselves, like KTM have their own chassis, they have their own suspension components, springs and damping and know-how, which is a big thing to do in MotoGP. So they started 45 years ago, and they're still fighting each other every weekend in the paddock. Yeah,
I mean, and Öhlins have just been incredibly successful. I mean, the last time they were beaten to the MotoGP World Championship was in 2006. When Nicky Hayden won the title on the Honda. That's when Honda was still using Showa, which was they've been using forever. Honda switched to Öhlins in 2009, I think, when Shuhei Nakamoto came in, and he came in and said, no, we've got to have the best suspension. I don't care whether it's Japanese or Swedish. So we want Öhlins suspension, and that's when he brought in the seamless gearbox and all that kind of stuff. When Nakamoto came to Honda, he made some big changes. So yeah, I mean, massively. The only bikes that don't use them in MotoGP are obviously the KTM's. All the other bikes use Öhlins. So yeah, I mean, apart from Brembo, who obviously completely supply the whole grid, Öhlins are the most successful supplier company without a doubt. Yeah, moving on, we've got a shot of some in the first thing you see when you go into Öhlins, obviously there's an area where they've got a lot of their products showing, all the shocks and stuff they do, not only for motorbikes, but also for four-wheeled stuff. And they work with Ferrari Formula One team. I think they actually equip half the Formula One grid as well. I think.
More than half the Formula One grid.
But yeah, but the
IndyCar, Formula One, they're everywhere.
Yeah, they're everywhere. And nonetheless, motorsport is only, from a financial point of view, is only 5% of their total business. Yeah.
Just one thing in between in this moment, I want to explain something to the listeners that we didn't mention yet, and it actually makes a lot of sense, because we say suspension, but we mean the damper systems and the spring system, which looks like one, because usually they are integrated in one module. But springs are not that. They are a lot harder and more complicated than most people think. So we also talk about later in this what about the springs, but it's the damping system that makes Öhlins and WP unique. That is to decide which damping curves you have, on what part of the stroke and with what speed you want, what type of character in the damping. That is what really makes the difference, because a spring is basically only just carrying the bike, but depending on the loads from the corner, from the braking, from the acceleration, and it's a damping that makes sure that the bike doesn't keep moving like a poker stick all the way around and has a stable contact between tire and tarmac, because that in the end is the beginning of all for grip. Stable contact.
I'm just very simply that there's basically two types of damping. There's compression damping, which varies the kind of rate and the speed of how the suspension works as it's compressing, and then there's rebound damping, which controls the suspension the spring as it's coming back up. And as Peter says, without damping, the bike will just be like a pogo stick, basically, just bouncing up and down and until the kind of spring just kind of runs out of energy, So
and the other thing here to add is that this damping is speed depending, not position depending. So wherever you are in your fork or your shock, if the fork doesn't move, which it does, in the end of the stroke and in the beginning of the stroke, there is no damping. And when it has the highest speed, that highest speed, usually in your front fork, for example, when you grab the brakes, when you're accelerating, the fork sits quite high. When you close the throttle and very aggressively take the brakes, you build up quite a high speed. And then more or less after 30% of your stroke from extended, it's where you reach the highest speed. You quickly build up a lot of speed in your front fork. And if you don't damp that speed, then you'll rely on your spring to carry it and not make the fork bottom. Then you need a super hard spring to prevent it from bottoming, which is unrideable. So you have a spring that carries it for the more or less the low speed, and you damping that takes control of the rest. This damping thing is so difficult to measure, to quantify, and to do, and also to make it reliable, because you have no place on MotoGP bikes. The shock absorber sits more or less in the worst possible place on the motorbike. So with all the exhaust and the oil and the temperatures, and it has to be super small and so on. So they have a lot of experience. That's why they exist as a high-end manufacturer for prototype racing. They have all the know-how to make these things small and super constant over a high temperature range. And also, they are always exactly as the way they want them. If they know they put in damping, compression damping A and rebound damping C in it, and after a couple of hours riding, it is still A and C. There's no change in it at all, because that should not be another variable. Which sounds easy, but is extremely difficult in the hard life of racing to achieve.
Yeah. moving on, we're going to take a look at and talk about their carbon fork. I can't remember how long they've had, but maybe must be about 10 years that they've had basically the carbon fiber outers of the fork, not the inners, not the slider, obviously. Obviously, weight is the main thing. That you save about 1.6 kilos, so 800 grams per fork, which is it's unsprung weight, so it's pretty important, really important to kind of help the bike work better. But also with a carbon fiber fork, you can vary the lay of the carbon fiber, and so you can make the fork stiffer in one direction than in another. And why would you want a fork that isn't stiff? Well, because when you're braking, you want the thing to be absolutely as strong as it can be, because obviously in those forces. But when you're leaning over and the suspension doesn't really work, when you're right at full lean, you want everything to be slightly flexible so that the bike can track the asphalt better. Öhlins have also used, I think they're using Moto 2. I think it's probably carbon fiber forks are banned in Moto 2, I think. They use aluminium forks outers, but they're oval, so that they kind of bend. They don't bend on the brakes, but they flex when the bike is in the middle of the corner.
Just also for the listeners, that when Matt says when in the corner when the suspension obviously doesn't work, that needs explaining, because if the bike's upright and you hit a bump, of course we all imagine the suspension is working. But when the bike makes 50 degree of lean angle or even 60 and it hit bumps, then the forces don't get into the suspension. They get more or less almost completely sideways into the chassis. So you want a chassis that is bending, but you cannot have one place in your chassis where it is bending, where it does all the bending. You can't have it. So you need a little bit of bending all around over the motorbike. And ideally, every time it bends, it changes the shape in a way that it tightens the corner instead of widening the corner, because then you have a bike that oversteers. So that's more or less what they're all looking for. So we need that softness, that absorption of the bumps mid-corner, because the suspension hardly works at all at that moment, because the forces don't get into the suspension at all.
Yeah, because they're going straight up, and the suspension system is kind of like that. So that's super important.
And these carbon things, Matt, it's the carbon outer tube they started with initially, and then when I was at Öhlins, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, they were telling they wouldn't tell me if the inner tube was also made of carbon. And then WP, when I was in the truck there, they showed me their products and they say, our inner tube is also made out of carbon and then has a ceramic coating on it. And so I went back last year to Öhlins and say, what about your inner tube? And they were just smiling. When they're smiling, and they like to smile, because it means they're very proud and they love the question, but they cannot tell it officially. So rest assured, the outer tube, inner tube is all made of carbon with a ceramic coating on it, so it has very little friction for all the movement. It's super light, and like Matt said, you can have the stiffness in the way where you want. Although these oval outer tubes have been around for a long, long time. I think I saw them in 2003 in some factory Honda superbikes already. So the idea is not new. And it has a certain downside that I heard from riders. If you're on tracks like Silverstone next week, some of the corners, Assens, Phillip Island, where you have high-speed change of direction, then you need your forks to be stiff sideways.
Yeah, true.
And then suddenly, for the rider, this can feel like an unnatural softness in the bike that he doesn't really appreciate. Because on high speed, the track automatically gets very, very narrow. Then you don't want a slow, late reaction from your chassis. When you give certain input in it, it needs to immediately follow your input. And if it first bends and then goes back to another position, you can't do that. Good. So it's not automatically very, very, always automatically better.
Yeah. I was surprised that to hear that Öhlins, the only thing they actually manufacture at their headquarters in Sweden is the carbon forks. The actual carbon part of the carbon forks. Everything else is manufactured and forged and cast and everything outside by outside suppliers, and they obviously won't tell us who those suppliers are. So the only thing we walked past the carbon fiber kind of room where they do that, and my God, it was kind of had about 85 padlocks on it and a million sort of signs saying "Do not enter." Basically, you've got to go in a full hamsat, a full sort of bodysuit, haven't you, to go in? What do they call them? Hamsat suits or whatever? I can't remember.
Don't ask me. I'm from Holland. I have no idea.
You've got breathing and everything. You're fully, completely, because it's nasty stuff. You don't want any carbon fiber getting either near your skin or in your lungs. So moving on to.
One other thing about the carbon forks, because I was interested how you deal with it when people crash. People crash with carbon forks.
Yeah.
And with aluminium, it's relatively straightforward. If it's not straightforward, it's bent. They used to throw it away. But with carbon, so they do the normal. They do the normal check. You check it for if it's still aligned. I don't know how you call it. Whether it's still round and straight and so on. And obviously they have some possibility to really quite completely X-ray it sort of at their headquarters. But that's an expensive and long process to do. What I think it was Öhlins. They told me that they also use. I don't know how you call it. I mean, Yamaha's badge is made out of 3 of them. So the music fork. I don't know how you call it in English.
The tuning fork.
They use a tuning fork as well, the technicians there.
Right,
and then listen to the sound when they go over the outer tube. When they doubt it, they open it, clean it, make it dry, and then test it for sound. Because if there's a weak point somewhere in the carbon, you will hear it.
I
found it interesting.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's like if you crack a mug or something, isn't it? A drinking mug, and it sounds completely different when you put it down on the table or whatever. And they also said when they get damaged stuff, it all goes back to the factory and it is completely destroyed. They don't let anybody keep, a damaged fork or whatever, or suspension as a souvenir or whatever. Everything gets completely destroyed so that nothing can, get out to a rival or whatever. They keep their sort of secrets very, very close to themselves.
If manufacturers have a demonstration or a show bike somewhere on an exhibition, which looks like a MotoGP bike from 1 or 2 years ago and has carbon forks and everything, what Öhlins told us is that, yes, manufacturers can do that on request, but only after Öhlins have modified the parts in Sweden, send them back to the manufacturer, put them in the bike. There are probably there is not even a damping system in it. So they're very much aware that it's quite high tech and people want to steal the secrets.
Yeah, and this does happen. My favorite story of all this is it was about 2004, 2005. Michelin were obviously they were ruling MotoGP, and the only other championship that they were contesting as a factory was the British Superbike Championship. And during a round of that year's British Superbike Championship, the Honda they were working with Honda UK. They were the only people using sort of factory Michelin tires, and the Honda truck got broken into on a Saturday night at one of the British Superbike races, and one rear slick on one rear wheel went missing. So industrial espionage does exist in racing. I mean, the usual way of industrial espionage is you sign an engineer from and WP took one of Öhlins' best engineers a few years ago. That's just, I mean, that all the factories are doing. Very rarely used to happen in the old days between the Aprilia, Honda. Very, very rarely. Now it happens all the time. People are always stealing, because that's what you do. You're just stealing the brains, basically. And that's why so many Ducati engineers are everywhere else, because they're obviously the best factory, and everybody's like, well, we've got to have a Ducati engineer who will tell us how they do it, Yeah, so now we're going to look at a rear shock, I think. Is that right?
For the people who follow us on the pictures, that's we call it picture 4, and it is the MotoGP rear shock.
Yeah, they are things of beauty.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you compare them to a road shock or to what Öhlins sells for the track days racer and the national level of racing, then the challenges are a little bit bigger because of the temperatures and the vibrations, the adjustability that they need. Just look at the time they told us that they need to build one shock. That is, I mean, a skilled engineer is 6 hours busy just to build one shock. I mean, a Swiss watch is probably faster to build. So
it takes, like Peter said, it takes 6 hours to build one shock. 6 hours, and obviously forks. To build a set of forks, 10 hours, and this is usually done quite often by the technicians who work with the riders at the beginning of the season. They all go to Öhlins and build up the shocks that they're going to use. Their riders are going to use. Most MotoGP riders have their own Öhlins suspension technician, who's obviously paid for by, like Marc Marquez has got his suspension technician, and Pecco Bagnaia has got his suspension technician. And that's all part of the service that the factories pay to Öhlins. So it's not only for the material, it's also for the technicians that you have at every race and every test.
They don't even literally buy the material because it remains property from Öhlins. They sort of lease the material, and they can make the contract as they want. I'm pretty sure Lucio Cecchinello has another contract than the Ducati factory, because if you have more money, you make another contract. But
sure.
The basic thing is that you have per bike 2 forks and 3 shocks. That's the base minimum that you need in a racing team. But you need crash parts, and you go to a weekend after 2 difficult weekends and you think there's something in the damping we need to try. You cannot, so you prepare a shock with another damping and have it on your workbench and put it somewhere in and enjoy it. And you always have a rain shock, at least one rain shock, and so on and so on. So you need a lot of material, and they have a guy that is dedicated to this rider from this team for the whole year. He's paid by Öhlins, but he works with Marc Marquez or with whoever in one of the MotoGP teams. That is. But we get later to that a little bit more. I found it always fascinating how it's possible that these 2 beautiful black trucks in the middle of the paddock, where they all work on their suspension units side by side. The guy that prepares Marc Marquez's shock is shoulder and shoulder by the guy that works on the shock for Fabio Quartararo. And they have not a lot of secrets for each other. So I found that fascinating. But we learn a lot about that as well, which made me also quite happy. And I was impressed by how they deal with it.
Yeah, because like you say, when you go into this 2 Öhlins juggernauts in the paddock, and there's an office at the front, but the most of the space of the juggernaut is a long workshop going with workbenches both sides, shock dynos, kind of everything in there. And like Peter says, you'll have somebody working, Marc Marquez's Öhlins technician stripping down a shock or a fork or whatever, doing whatever, changing this, that, or changing the damping or whatever. And then next to him will be somebody doing, factory Aprilia, Bezzecchi's shock or whatever. So that's quite tricky, that they obviously, the Marquez's guy doesn't want, Bezzecchi's guy to know what he's doing, so it's an interesting setup, but they make it work. They obviously, to get that level of trust from the factories is pretty important,
We get to that a little bit later. What about the shock, before we move on to the next picture, that we ask obviously about, so how long does a shock live? It's an aluminium, it's machined, and they say basically 2 seasons. And then you don't measure it, you don't see that it is already wearing out. It's all within the limits, but at some point they say after 2 years we just, it becomes probably a shock for a demonstrator bike or whatever. Unless somewhere in the middle of the season there comes an update, they find something better which really needs a new housing for the shock, then it can have a lifetime of only half a year because there comes a complete new shock. That's also possible. But generally, 2 years is the lifetime, but that doesn't mean you put it in the bike and after 2 years you take it out. They take it out every week, probably 3-4 times, and they service the same shock. They don't need to count the mileage and we need to do the oil, because they open it all the time. Because people, first of all, because you change damping characteristics from track to track. If you go to different tracks, you quite likely have another tire, and that can easily mean you need another damping characteristic based on your experience from last year and so on and so on. So they open the shocks all the time, let alone when there was a crash. If there's a crash, you need to open anyway everything and rebuild it completely again. They have a little dyno with them on the track to do the normal, but that's more like a test dyno if everything's okay. There is more dynos that we speak later on in this podcast that we saw in Sweden where they do the development.
Yeah. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice that Öhlins shock doesn't have a yellow spring. Obviously, that's what Öhlins have kind of been famous. That's what, they're trying to mark themselves out. So that's what they've always had, yellow springs. And then they went to the gold anodized aluminium, the fork outers and all that kind of stuff. So, and the funny thing is that some, I think probably Indian and Chinese manufacturers, who are obviously a little bit further out of the kind of loop of the main motorcycle manufacturers, that they will make their motorbikes now. They sell their motorbikes from standard with yellow springs just to make them kind of look like Öhlins. And just while I'm on that, really funny, I've seen a video a few times of shocks with the piggyback reservoirs. If you've got a road bike with twin shocks, it'll have little piggyback reservoirs for the oil out the back. And I can't remember which manufacturer it is, but there's a video, you find it on YouTube, video of somebody just soaring through between the piggyback reservoir and the shock itself, and it's just solid. There's actually, it's not a reservoir. It's just a piece of aluminium casting, so Jesus Christ. Yeah. Some people are, not very nice.
Well, this reservoir is also an interesting thing. Why we need a reservoir, and the shocks in MotoGP don't have an external reservoir, but they have it inside for a very, very simple reason. If you compress a shock, then the rod goes into the main body. That means all the oil and that is in the main body, you cannot compress oil. You can compress air, but you cannot compress the oil. So if the rod comes in, the oil has to go somewhere. And that simply alone is already the reason that we have a little extra reservoir, which is just a cylinder with a little piston in the middle. And it is filled for half with the oil, connected with the oil in the shock. And the other side of the piston is usually some high pressure air or nitrogen or whatever to keep the whole system under pressure. Because if the shock extends, rebound speeds can also be quite high. Then the oil needs to follow quickly. That's why we have a reservoir in shocks.
Sure. Which takes us neatly onto a beautiful photo of two shock front fork bottoms. With so you've got the slider, and then you've got the amazing. They're just beautiful CNC milled.
How you call them in English? Wheel adapters.
We call them wheel adapters or whatever. Yeah. I'm just trying to think of the correct word, but yes. So I mean, many years ago they just carried the brakes, but now they carry all kinds of other stuff like they carry the fender, they carry they carry aerodynamic devices, ground effect devices, and so on. I think they cost about €3,000 each. I think a set of these forks is about €15,000. The carbon forks, isn't it? Something like that.
I'm not surprised. I
think it's something like that. I mean, these are you're talking minimal quantities made of them, and the technology that goes into them is pretty insane. So the reservoirs on the bottom of the forks here, are they oil reservoirs or not?
Yeah,
Peter?
They are reservoirs. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So that's just what we were talking about.
Yeah.
I mean those the shock bottoms. I think that's just fork bottoms. That's just what they call them, fork bottoms. They are just absolute works of art, man.
And they're all very different. When you look at them close, they're so beautifully made. But every manufacturer has his own carbon covers for the brakes and his own aero device that he wants. But more importantly, has his own philosophy of how he wants them to bend, because they are part of this of the bending that you need and that they have. So obviously you don't want too much bending, but you can't make them too stiff. That is also a dangerous thing. It's proven that it needs to have. So Öhlins produces them, but based on the drawing that they get from the manufacturer.
Yeah. So every bike will have different. All the bikes will have different shock bottoms, fork bottoms, and that might change during the year as well. If Ducati introduces a new aero device, they'll need a new fork bottom to carry that if it's carried. And just talking about the stiffness of the fork bottom, I was just doing a bit of research for a story I'm writing, and this was probably 10 years ago or something, when Valentino Rossi and Jorge Lorenzo were both at Yamaha, and they used to have different axle stiffness. So the axle in the front wheel, so the axle's different, the stiffness around is different. Lorenzo, because he was super smooth and precise, needed more a stiffer axle and fork bottom, whereas Rossi, who had a bit more of a kind of aggressive style needed slightly tiny little bit of flex in them just to suit his riding style. So the amount of kind of detail work that goes into this stuff, you know, you just when you're standing there looking at a set of forks on a MotoGP bike, you have no idea of what goes into them. And obviously, well, next photo is what actually does go into them, which is the damping rods. So this is Öhlins engineer building up a load of damping rods in the assembly section. There's all obviously various different sections of the Öhlins race department. So you've got, you know, research areas, development areas, dyno areas, and then this is the assembly area which is just like cleaner than my house, without a doubt.
Yeah.
I better not say it's cleaner than our kitchen because Debs might kill me. Yeah, but I mean, it's an impressive place, very quiet, and just people going steadily about their business. You know, there's no room for mistakes here.
What you see here on this picture on the workbench is what they call the cartridges, which is because the front fork, as we just saw it in the other pic, is just provides us with the possibility to steer the motorbike and to have the wheel in place. And then in these tubes you put springs. That is the easy part to understand. But the damping inside the forks it's basically a shock absorber, just like we have in the rear, just a lot longer and a lot thinner to fit into the front fork. But the general idea is the same. It's a piston in oil and so on and so on. So they normally call it the cartridge unit that is inside the front fork. And if they want to change, the things you change on front forks in racing is the spring, which is the easiest thing to do, because you remove the top cap, you take out the spring, you put in a new spring. You can change the amount of oil, add some oil or take some oil out, which is also quickly to do. Or you want to change the damping system, that if you don't reach your goal by adjusting the clicks for compression or rebounds, which is also an option. If you really want to do the main character different, like more compression damping everywhere, just not on the clicks, then you need to open the whole front fork, take out the cartridge, open the cartridge, and start to take out all the different shims that are on a very tiny little piston and build them up in another sequence, other shims that bigger and thicker and smaller and so on, until as it is written on your computer how to do it. And then you have exactly the characteristic for compression or rebound that you were looking for. Then everything back together. So that's what these guys basically are doing all the time. That's what they do in their own corner. All the manufacturers have in the back of the pit box the corner for the suspension guy, which is a workbench, which is completely only made for working on shocks and on forks. They have it overseas usually with them in the pit box. Or Öhlins has somewhere an office where everybody comes with the shocks and the forks to do this type of work.
Yeah, I mean, quite often now, in fact, pretty much all the teams now, I think, have a little kind of trolley, you know, two or three levels on it, which sits at the front of the garage between the two riders, with all the kind of springs and stuff there sat there so that they can make super quick. I think it takes like a minute to change both springs in the shocks, which is pretty crazy, really.
In the fork,
but I mean, you know,
this is
in the fork, sorry. But this is also important to make. You know, it's not just about making things that perform well on the racetrack. You make them perform well in the garage by being easy to change. You know, if you're going to waste 3-4 minutes changing springs in your forks, you've already lost a lap or two of practice. You know, so it's essential that everything is as user friendly as possible, so that, you know, you waste as little time making changes in the garage as you can. You know, hugely important that is. You know, not just in suspension, in every aspect of the motorbike. You know.
I remember when we had this former Rossi mechanic in the podcast a couple of years ago and spoke about the time he went with Valentino to Ducati, and he was so frustrated by the build of the MotoGP bike of the Ducati at that time from Rossi, because it took ages to take out the shock, and you can't do that because every lap is super important during a race weekend. There's never enough time to try things, especially at that time with the Ducati. So if you're waiting 12, 13 minutes to change the shock, that's a no-go. You can't do that.
Yeah. And also sort of little things like, you know, in one area of the bike, you might have, you know, three or four different, you know, nuts and bolts of different sizes when they don't actually need to be that
just
way.
Just because theoretically that's the best size. But in reality, in the pit box, you need 20,000 tools and keys.
No, exactly. If the mechanic has to keep changing spanner and everything, you know, it's going to cost you time. Moving on, we've got another photo of building the shock fork cartridges, and then we go on to a inner fork tube test bench. So this is one of the kind of dynos test benches or whatever. So what's going on in this photo? I mean, Peter?
Well, they have the front fork in a bench, and then they can run a certain test with it that they program on forehand. This means they're going to make it move like a bike, like it does in a bike, with certain strokes, combinations of strokes and speeds, rebound and compression, and so on and so on. And at the same time, they have load cells on both ends of this test cell that measures the forces. And in the case of this fork, they even have very sensitive, high logging rate oil pressure sensors to check what the oil pressure does when the fork is moving. When the fork is moving, the piston is moving, it's moving through the oil, it creates different oil pressures left and right. And they calculate all of this, but they still need to go to the dyno to see if it really works like that. Because if one little hole is just a little too small, then there is a pressure difference that you didn't expect on both sides of that orifice, and then you have a problem. Then your damping is not what you want it to be. So that's what they're testing here. So basically, they have you can think about it a little bit like a crankshaft and a conrod mechanism. That on the conrod you put your front fork, and if you turn the crankshaft, the fork goes in, out, in, out, in, out. But it's also like you can change the position from the conrod in the crankshaft to make every circle of the crankshaft you make a short stroke, and if you bring the conrod to the outside, every circle of the crankshaft you make a long stroke, and then they can quickly make all types of combination with it: long stroke with high speed, short stroke with high speed, long stroke with low speed, and then at the same time measuring all the forces that are getting absorbed. Because, like I said, springs are carrying the bike, and damping is absorbing some of the energy to spread it out.
Yeah. And moving on, we got another photo of a Öhlins lab technician, because basically these are laboratories where they're just testing everything on dynos and so on. And we actually watched a set of Öhlins forks riding around Valencia. So they obviously got all the data from a team. Obviously, they didn't say which team, and they put that into the computer in the lab, and that basically we stood there and watched these set of forks. I mean, they're obviously vertically. Yeah, and then we got a photo of an Öhlins lab technician, because basically they're working in laboratory conditions, doing all these dyno tests and everything. And what he's doing there, you can see he's got a set of front forks on the rig on the dyno, and using data from a MotoGP team, they obviously won't say which, these forks were doing a full lap of Valencia, and we were watching. You could see there's turn one, okay, and then going up to turn two, and a little bit of chatter going into turn two, and all. It was very cool. Obviously, this is just a damping test, because the forks are vertically in the dyno. They're not put in. That's all they're doing is testing the damping. And what they can actually do, if a team has got a particular bad problem and they really need help from Öhlins that can't be done at the track, they can actually send data back to Öhlins during a race weekend, and Öhlins will put the shock or the forks on the dyno and run through and see what the problem is, and see if they can help the team, and then tell the team what they should do for the race. So I mean that kind of amazed me, really. Yeah,
technically that definitely must be possible. What my question immediately was like, you're testing, but you're basically looking for something that you should know. So it's more like I'm confirming what I know is happening, because you build the fork yourself, you choose the character and so on. So it's also like a final test of a set of forks. But I will not be surprised if they have one other dyno that they didn't show us that also put the side loads on the fork. Because if you're braking with a MotoGP bike, the arm of the front fork is pretty long, even when it compresses. So you bending, it must bend. Everything bends in the force. The question is just how much. And if it still does what you want it to do during bending, that is the $1 million question. Because a fork that works beautifully when it's just straight up and down on the dyno is one thing, but it needs to do the same quality of damping, absorbing the pumps, and keeping stiction-free moving when there is 1.5 G at work for the bending. So that is another thing. I'm pretty sure they have something like that, or they can simulate it very, very accurately. But that is the most important thing, basically.
Yeah, Peter just used the word stiction, which is basically, obviously, with either a fork or a shock, you want no friction. Well, you want minimum friction, and you want it sort of the same at all times. You don't want the tolerances they actually wouldn't tell us how far they go on the tolerances, because that's another sort of secret thing. But yeah, you don't want the fork to be to have any moment of friction as it goes up and down, and that's what you call stiction. When if the forks are sticking or the shock's sticking in a certain area, that's what's called stiction. We also went into the warehouse and we saw them making their production shocks for road bikes and so on, which was quite interesting. But I mean, a lot of different springs. So we saw the yellow springs, which is standard, and then we saw the titanium springs. Tell us about titanium springs and why they're so cool, Peter.
First of all, springs are obviously not. The spring carries the thing. To make an accurate spring is not as easy as it sounds. We are used to mention the spring in the spring rate. That means a certain force gives a certain deformation. So if it's a 10 spring, then it's 10 millimeter for 10 Newton. Then it's 10 millimeters. I don't know. Now I forgot it. It's millimeters or kilos for centimeters or millimeters. So it's a certain force, and then it starts to move a certain distance. This is one thing that you need to achieve. Usually, for example, when you have a 9 spring in your front fork and you want to go harder, you go to 9.2, 9.4. But you want to make sure that the 9.2 is really 9.2. And this is one of the things where it becomes already interesting. I don't even want to speak about road bikes because they must be all over the place. But if you buy normal race springs from Öhlins, sorry Öhlins, I've got to say it, and it says 80, it's definitely everything but 80. It's somewhere between 79 and 81 if you're lucky. So if you go from an 80 to an 85 and you have bad luck, you go from an 82 to an 83. It means nothing. Or you make a big step from 78 to whatever, So the force itself has to be accurate. Now, and then the second thing, it has to be a linear. So it has to be over the stroke that the shock makes. It still has to be the same spring rate. If you add this amount more force on it, it has to move the same amount of millimeters. And that's also not so easy to do. So they're all looking for the best suppliers over the world, throw away a lot of springs that are out of the tolerance. So there is road bikes. I don't want to speak about them. There is normal springs, usually the yellow ones that you buy from Öhlins for your hobby racing, for your track day bike. He's already a lot better than a road spring, but he's quite likely not very, very accurately the number that you want. In MotoGP and Moto2 and Moto3, they all have springs that are later calibrated again. So you see a handwritten number on it, which says the real value. So 82.5. Yeah. Okay, thank you, 82.5. So you have that one. And it does this 82.5 only for a limited amount of time. If you wait 10 years and you ride around with it for years, it's definitely not still 82.5. So the race teams usually send them back to Öhlins to have them checked again, have the number written on it. So you have the spring rate, you have the linearity. That is a problem. That is difficult to achieve. And now in MotoGP, and I think at the moment probably everybody is on titanium springs. Simply because, and really only for one simple thing, it's lighter. And it's not a lot lighter, but everything is important on MotoGP. So, yeah. And to make a titanium spring that has an accurate spring rate, and it's also linear, that's even harder than from steel. So they cost a fortune for a couple of 100 grams, and that's where they are.
Yeah, I think 200 grams per spring is per shock is not an awful lot of weight, is it? No. And about 4 times the cost. And so, how would you want to sort of have a vague pop at how much a titanium MotoGP spring would cost?
No, I don't know, but I can imagine you have like 10, 15 springs with you for one rider.
Yeah.
For the shock, and then probably less of them for the fork. Because in forks, actually, you usually change only one spring, because the total amount is what matters. So if you're on a total of 10 and you have 2 springs of 10 in it, and you want to go to 9.5, you change 1 10 for a 9, and then you're on an average of 9.5. So that's for the front springs. But yeah, this titanium thing, this is giving headache to the manufacturers. I was told by Öhlins, and also a little bit longer ago by WP. This is. But yeah, a couple of 100 grams is a lot on a MotoGP bike.
I guess. Yeah. Everything counts. Okay, next shot. A load of pressurized canisters for preload changes in a green box. Tell us what these do, Peter.
One of the things that you adjust actually quite often on your racing bike, before you start changing the spring itself, you can change the amount of preload that you put on the spring. Because the spring on the shock, if you have the shock on your bench and there is a spring fitted on it, the spring is not loose. It's not fitted with 0 millimeter preload. It is already preloaded on the shock. Then you put the shock in the motorbike, just to have as a result that when you take the bike off the stands, it goes a couple of millimeters in by itself. When the rider sits in it, it already takes whatever 20-30% of the total stroke in it. So that is the preload. So if you put from that moment on, if you add 2 millimeters preload to a spring, you just raise the bike 2 millimeters. It doesn't make suspension harder by adding preload. You just raise it or lower it by preload. So it's a quick way to change where you are in the suspension. And teams do that quite often. And to do that, normally, is quite a lot of work. On your road bike, again, it's a lot of work because there is 2 big nuts and you need to hammer one and whatever. So on racing motorbikes, they're usually on the Öhlins production shocks. You usually have an Allen screw on the outside that you need to turn, and then every turn of the adjusting screw does 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter of preload to the mainspring. That's not even good enough for MotoGP. In MotoGP, they have a little device. Instead of 2 nuts, they have a little device that holds the spring. And that, how to explain in English? Anyway, you put pressure on it, and it sort of compresses the spring by itself. So it takes the pressure off from a big nut that you can turn with your fingers around the whole body of the shock. Yeah. Normally, obviously, because there is all the pressure from the spring on it, you cannot turn the nut by fingers. But if you connect on it's a dry connector, this blue hose on this canister, you connect it to the shock, immediately you can see the spring moving, and then you are free to do with your hand, turn the whole nut 1, 2, 3 millimeter, just the amount of preload you want to change, take your fingers off, take the canister off, and it springs back. It's a very fast way to do it. And yeah, this brings me to another subject. One of the Öhlins, not one of the engineers, it was more a marketing guy, told us that he was surprised that they sell so many of these. I don't see these in national racing here in Holland and Germany a lot, because it's quite an expensive thing. And it saves only very little time, because the cheaper option is you go there with a tool and you turn a couple of turns on the tool. But just because we always see these things in MotoGP, that was the reasoning from the Öhlins guy. He said, we sell way too many of them. This means people love it so much, they want to have it.
Yeah.
Okay,
if it's being used in MotoGP, we must have it for whatever Superbike Championship we're doing or whatever. Yeah. Okay, and so now we've got a nice photo of the assembly area. So it was kind of pretty quiet when we were there, because it was just like a couple of days before Brno, the Czech Grand Prix, wasn't it? So not a lot of people around. But there's just everything there, that you need. And as we were saying earlier, this is where the sort of technicians come before the pre-season to build their shocks and forks for the year, and get to know the kind of latest specs. Peter?
Yeah, because when there is constant evolution, so there is something new in the shock or in the fork, and that needs to be explained to the technicians so they know when to use it for certain problems, but also it needs different handling. Maybe you need to put more pressure on something when you build it, or you need a super tiny screw and be careful not to damage it and so on. So they learn the benefits of every new development and how to work with it in reality. Yeah, usually all the technicians go there, build their own material, which then get shipped to the teams or to Sepang to the first test, whatever. And from there on, they don't get there anymore. But Now we get to the thing that was that I was quite interested in, because I never really got the answer satisfactory before, and now I completely understand the system, because they explained it, and they needed to explain it because they started to explain how they work with this special shock for Ducati, for Marc Marquez basically, and Pecco as well, for the Ducati Lenovo factory team. So that brought everything to in a clear situation. So yeah, first of all, like you said earlier, I was always surprised at how can these Öhlins engineers, which are good friends with each other, they're like a family group, and they are side by side in the truck working on for the different manufacturers. There is no secret. Everybody knows what they're doing. So how you deal with that? That was the thing that interested me most. Yeah, first some numbers, like each Öhlins technician is connected for the season to one rider. That there is usually around 15 Öhlins people at the GPs. Interestingly, in Formula 1, where they supply the majority of the field, there is zero. There is no Öhlins people in Formula 1. The teams buy the stuff from Öhlins according to their spec and then handle them themselves. That is quite a difference, actually.
Yeah.
And all the teams and all. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was just saying it's a sort of fairly family atmosphere. I mean, MotoGP paddock can be it is a very serious place, and it gets more and more serious. But you notice there's definitely different kind of atmospheres with different companies. It might be different motorbike manufacturers or different suspension manufacturers or different tire manufacturers. They've all kind of, the way they go about their work. But the Öhlins lot have always been very friendly. They all seem to have a nice time together. You know what I mean? Although they're working hard, and they all seem to be kind of enjoying what they do and taking it seriously, but not letting that kind of make them sort of overly serious and kind of desperate, about what they're doing. So
they're not the only manufacturer that is involved in all the race teams, because Brembo is and Magneti Marelli is, but They are the only that are in every race team and can make the difference. Marelli is just to check everything works, nobody's cheating. Brembo, you ask us for advice, we tell you which disc to do. If you have a problem, we try to help you, but you make the decision which disc, which diameter, master cylinder, which pads. We just help you make the decision. But with Öhlins, it's another thing. At some point, everybody starts to look at the Öhlins technician during a meeting. Imagine you go to Brno, and like in the past, when Brno was really bumpy, then for sure the guy gets a lot of stares in the first session, because everybody looks at him. The rider complains a lot about the bumps and how to deal with that. Now, the crew chief has experience. He has some ideas. Everybody has some ideas, but there will be a lot of staring at you to come up with a suggestion. You don't decide, you give a suggestion, which is a beautiful position to be in, but you need to be able to handle the pressure and be diplomatic and politically very sharp, that people will always trust you.
Yeah. Kind of without a doubt, the most interesting thing during the visit, partly because we didn't know about it. I mean, generally, we will get to hear about some new part or whatever, mechanics talk and stuff like that. You find out stuff. But during this visit, we were told that, Marquez and Bagnaia, just the factory Ducati team, have been using a special rear shock since the start of last season. Basically, none of the other factories are allowed to run it. And you go like, well, how can that be possible? How can they help Ducati and not the others? That's because if a factory comes to them and say, we want to do this, we want to achieve this with a shock or forks or whatever, will you work with us on that? And Öhlins says, yep, okay. So they have to do that in complete secrecy. You imagine how tricky that is. Again, because they're sharing a work area a lot of the time. So they basically say, okay, we're going to develop it together, and you will then be able to use it on your own for a year or whatever, and then we're allowed to sell it or lease the technology to the other factories. So what they showed us, there's been a lot of talk about it since the visit, because that was when the world found out about it, is the a stroke limiting device, rear shock. So basically this is what Ducati wanted to do. They wanted to get, obviously they were the people that brought in the ride height device and the whole shot device, and they wanted to get even lower. Obviously the whole point of the ride height device and the whole shot device is to lower the back of the motorcycle, which lowers the overall mass, the center of mass of the motorcycle, so it wheelies less. And so that gives you a big advantage off the start, and it also gives you a big advantage coming out of corners, because you can use more throttle, you can use more acceleration. So this problem was they were already dropping the bike so much that the fairing was grinding on the track coming out of some corners, and that could lead to a crash, obviously, because it could interrupt the rear tire sort of grip. So basically, Ducati went to Öhlins and said, right, we want to go even lower, and we want you to help us go even lower. So what they came up with is, I'm going to explain it in my very simple, non-technical way, and then Peter will go a bit deeper. So the rear ride height device works via the push-pull rod in the shock linkage, right? So it goes longer or shorter according to whether the bike is up or whether the bike is down. And so what Öhlins came up with was a movable platform at the bottom of the shock that is linked into the hydraulics of the ride height device, which at certain corners, the rider can press an extra button, shortens the stroke of the shock. This movable platform comes up. I mean, it's so trick. I mean, really very, very trick. Movable platform comes up, reducing the shock by the shock stroke by nearly 50%. And that, so then the fairing won't hit the track. That's kind of my simple way of dealing with it. You can explain more, Peter, about how they kind of started off. I know they had other ways of trying to do this, but by basically just locking the suspension, which sounds like a horrible thing. You don't want to have, if you're racing a motorbike, you don't want the suspension locked.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, you said normally we hear little rumors, but this time was not. Well, there were one or two rumors, at least around me. I heard one or two people saying something, pointing at some of the red bikes. There must be something there. I think they're doing this, or I heard about something there, but I never got my finger really on it. And it's only after we visited Öhlins that everything became really clear what was happening. And so we listened to, I have some sources in the paddock, and we have the official source here at Öhlins, what they explained. And if I make a summary of that and fill in some of the holes, I think the history started with Ducati asking Öhlins, we want lower during the start. We want to stay lower during the start. How can you help us with that? And that's the thing that Öhlins didn't confirm. So this is my interpretation of the thing. I think they did it by this very simple way, by locking the hydraulics, like you do on mountain bikes. If you want no suspension because you're pedaling on the tarmac, you don't want to lose any energy, you lock the hydraulic from your suspension. So it can't compress, it can't rebound, you block the hydraulics. I think that's what they did initially, and they were probably happy with it, because then they started to ask for the next step. We also want to do it out of certain corners. On most tracks, they have, I would say, 3 to 5, 6 times a lap, depending on the track, that they can push the lever and make sure that the ride height drops out of a certain corner. From these 3, 4, 5, 6 corners, there will be probably 1 or 2 where it also will be beneficial if you go even lower and have almost no suspension movement left. So they went there, and then they've learned that no, with the hydraulics locked during the riding, the actual riding, that's too much. That is way too hard. We're eating the tires, and the rider, his ass gets destroyed. It's not possible. So they went for another solution. That's the solution that you just explained, that they have the manufacturer, Ducati in this case, provided hydraulic pressure and a valve that he actuates, he decides when something happens. And Öhlins made a shock that has an extra option in it, that it sort of lifts the floor. If you imagine the rod from the shock that goes into the body, it has usually a rubber bump stop around it from 10, 50 millimeters long. From when you're almost on the end of the stroke, you don't want to have a mechanical lockout. You start to get into the bump. This is really extra hard end of the stroke. What they do is they lift the floor, so the shock can almost make very, very little stroke only. It's almost basically you're immediately in the bump stop. So they don't make the shock shorter, but they make sure it can move only a very little bit. Only, I would say 20 millimeters is the shock movement that is still possible. And that's what they've been using all year in Ducati factory. So the rider then has the option, of course, but at the start they go super, super low with this device. Then during the riding, I think they don't use it everywhere. I think they can choose before a corner whether they want the normal ride high device to the normal low point, or you have a very smooth exit without any curbs. You want to go extra low to just take a little bit more advantage of the extra acceleration, because in the end, all you're doing here is try, when you succeed in doing this, you accelerate a little bit better. Bike wheelies less, so it has better drive. It's literally mechanical grip, what you're giving there. So, and then what you said, Max, about so Ducati and Öhlins make a deal. Ducati pays Öhlins to do what they did. They make the whole system work, but then part of the deal is you cannot have this secret forever. So you have it for 1 year. In the end of last year, I think they told us was in October, they told the other manufacturers, we have this option. We've been using it with one manufacturer for all year. You can have it as well next year if you want. And this is how it works. This is what we can offer. And obviously, they didn't want to tell us or confirm us if others also want it or not. So.
Yeah, I don't think any of the other factories, the other Öhlins using factories, i.e. Honda, Yamaha, and Aprilia are using it. But I spoke to Aprilia technical director Fabiano Sterlachini in Germany, the last race, and he said they're thinking about it. So, I mean, there's half the season left. And the thing is that this system will go at the end of this year because obviously ride height devices are being banned, aren't they? So I don't think it'll have any use as far as I would imagine.
Well, the ride height device is banned, but not limiting the stroke of the shock yet.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite possible that they will specifically ban it. But why would you want to limit the stroke without the ride height device? No. So we got a couple of pictures. We got a picture of Marquez and Bagnaia doing practice starts at Sepang during tests, and we got a shot of Mark coming out of a corner with the ride height device engaged. So the rear of the bike sat very low, I really don't like the way bikes look when the thing is.
No, it's a broken chassis. I feel sorry for it.
Exactly.
It's
your frame's snapped in half, mate. And then we got a couple of illustrations that if you're struggling to understand how it all works, a perfect little illustration from Öhlins of the stroke limiting device shock on the left. The illustration on the left is with the floor and the shock floor in its normal place, and then on the right you can see it's raised up. So it comes up on 3 or 4 smaller rods. I mean, it's just such a beautiful piece of engineering. It really is. Just the quality of it is fantastic. And then we got another illustration that shows how the shock hydraulics are linked up to the they call it the hydraulic black box, which is what you see in the front of that massive weird kind of aluminium casting or CNC cast. In the fairing nodes of the Ducati, so that's obviously running all the hydraulics for the ride height and also for the stroke limiting device. So I struggled to understood how it worked for a while, but I got there in the end. The
thing, Matt, with when Aprilia said we are thinking about it, of course everybody's thinking about it.
Yeah.
It's not something you can add to any bike and will just benefit from it. If you lay your hands on special fuel, you just put in the special fuel, maybe do your mapping and you're faster. This is in an area of the whole design of the bike where everything already is a compromise. So it's when you're in the middle of the season, you don't say, that's a good idea, thank you. Next race we have it as well. No. You need to go back to the drawing board and more or less redesign the whole bike. Packaging is changing, aero is changing. If you have these spoons towards the swing arm, you can't have them anymore. So you don't have the spoons, so you need to have your aero differently. just in order to have this. It's a huge compromise, and I will not be surprised if it's one of these things that I heard more about in the past couple of years. If Gigi finds something that exists, something that gives him 0.001 horsepower or seconds, he goes for it. Whatever, even if it brings 20 wires and 10 cables and an extra computer, he goes for it. So, which is beautiful. I mean, he's extremely competitive in this, but it also means that you shouldn't always copy immediately everything you see at Ducati. They have their own philosophy.
Sure.
So but interesting that how it works is already interesting, but I find it more telling and explaining that how they deal with it. Ducati came with the question, they pay the invoice, Öhlins makes the stuff, but also says after 1 year, it's for everybody. And the same goes if one of the manufacturers comes, as another example, changing, I mean, at the moment, the geometry from the suspension system in the rear is not very different, not as different as it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. Everybody has a link ratio. That is the ratio that the shock moves compared to the wheel pin. So if you move the wheel pin 1 millimeter, the shock moves more or less half a millimeter, because that ratio is 2 to 1. And that can be linear, that can be progressive, it can be degressive. But we've been past the wildest years in the past, and I think everybody's more or less around the 1 to 2 and pretty linear. But if one manufacturer comes and says, I want a whole other ratio, and it's probably going to be progressive as well, because I see a future for that, then they have to speak to Öhlins first, because if you change the link ratio, you change your damper speeds. And everything is based on speeds. All the damping is based on speeds. So if they can have something for themselves. And if they make the whole bike work very, very well with another link ratio, then giving that shock to somebody else doesn't make him very happy, because sure. It's part of the whole design.
Yeah, and kind of finishing off, we got a photo of a very beautiful photo of Peter, me, and the main man at Öhlins Racing. So that's Jonas Torstensson, who is the manager of the Öhlins motorcycle racing department, and Jonas is he's
the biggest fan himself, He loves it.
I mean, he's taken over about a year ago or something from Mats Larsson, who's been at Öhlins for about 1 million years, and now owns a Harley. I can tell everybody that.
And a horse.
I mean, they've, like I say, they've always been one of those companies. I won't name some others, but you go to ask them questions, and they're all looking at you suspiciously, like saying, "Oh my God, what's he going to do?" And why is he asking us this? But Öhlins have always been super happy to discuss things. Obviously, they've got all their secrets and they keep them. They're not going to tell you that, but they'll all talk to you for as long as you want about chatter and stuff like that. We haven't really talked about chatter. Maybe we'll have some chatter about chatter next time. But I've spoken to Mats for about 1 million years at MotoGP races, and I remember talking to him about chatter a few years ago when it became a real big thing again. It kind of comes and goes depending on tires and stuff like that. And with chatter, it can have the front tire bouncing through 3-4 millimeters off the racetrack. I wonder why riders crash or can't go fast when they've got chatter. Try riding a motorbike with the tires that aren't really in contact with the tarmac, and you'll know what it's all about.
Yeah, that's when Öhlins comes into play always, because the first thing you look at when you have chatter is you assume the damping is not working. You don't assume my spring is not working because my bike has a normal position, but somehow these movements from the wheel doesn't get damped out, so they go through the whole bike. They get into a harmony with the different frequencies, and suddenly I can't even hold the handlebars anymore. So we're all looking at the Öhlins guy, but in reality, it's for years and years in a row now that the quality of the suspension cannot be the source. Can maybe try to solve it a little bit, but don't overestimate what the suspension damping can do if your tire, because the tire usually is the problem. If the tire really starts to grip slide in the way that it starts to increase this moment by itself until we really literally see it, then then you're dreaming if you think a couple of clicks on the damping will solve the problem. It's not. The problem is then the tire grip point. That's what it is.
Yeah. The most recent kind of case of chatter was when Michelin brought its 2024 tire in, rear tire. And, well, that was more than just chatter. It was vibration. And I think everyone has seen the clip of Jack Miller at Motegi with the back of his bike of his KTM going absolutely crazy. Yeah, that's bad chatter.
Another thing about Öhlins when I'm looking at Jonas here is that he was almost sorry that he became head of the racing department because he didn't want to be. I want to be behind the drawing board and in the pit box. He's a technician. He said, but it's philosophy in Öhlins that we only take managers that come from the workflow, that are technicians. We don't ask human resources to bring in a brilliant manager that has a very good resume from on his last company. No. We want people from ourselves that come from the floor.
That is so, it's the cause of so much problems, not only in racing. Well, because in racing, because it's such a meritocracy, people are pretty well sorted about how to run a race team. Like you say, you don't bring in a manager from outside, generally. You want somebody who knows about racing. And it's a huge problem more in real life, isn't it? Where you have some really important company, let's say a hospital or whatever, and you bring in some guy to run the hospital who ran a hotel before or whatever. You need to know how things work from the ground up to run anything, I think, anyway. That's my
the other thing that I found funny from Jonas is that two other things that were interesting. First one was they're like leading manufacturer for years. Everybody, if you build yourself a dream bike, the suspension is not even a question. You go to Öhlins and buy what they have, whether it's a track day bike or whatever. But they're not resting on their laurels. One of the things he noticed just on the side a little bit, but if one of the Japanese manufacturers, if Showa, for example, really wants, we have a problem because these are big, big companies. And if they come to the paddock, they don't come to play. Then then we have suddenly a big, big job on our hands. That was one thing he said. The other thing, I reminded him saying in Moto2 and Moto3, I think it was especially Öhlins always told me, we want Moto2 and Moto3. These are the feeder classes, talent classes. We don't want a technical war with WP. That's the only other player we have in this class. So we keep it basic there. But that only works so far. And this year we've seen in Moto2 that people even in the season want to swap to WP because it turns out to be at the moment the suspension that works just a little bit better. At least that's what they're thinking. And he was just happy with that because now I can open throttle and we need to go back to the drawing board. I can put in more ideas in Moto2 and Moto3. He said, he just loves the competition and the challenge.
No, they do, and like you say, there's no arrogance there. Even though they just dominate everything, there's no arrogance, and that can be another thing in the paddock. If one particular, some manufacturers suffer from it more than others. Honda had a big arrogance problem. They were very arrogant. Their engineers 20 years ago, I remember 25 years ago. And, eventually it will bite you in the arse.
Yeah. If you motivate the others even more.
Exactly. And if you're arrogant, you're not thinking straight, basically. You've got to be humble. All right. I think we're done.
Didn't we
That's
forget
our
anything?
Öhlins visit.
Yeah.
I don't think so. That's our Öhlins visit. We had a very nice time. Cool. All right.
Yeah, I think we did
everything. For listening.
1 hour, 20 minutes. That's a long one. That's a long one. I hope people enjoyed it. It's a little bit of a different one. We haven't done many technical things, and I know I pushed a lot for this, Matt. Thank you for
congratulations
for helping me a lot in this one, because alone I would suffer to explain it. I think together we have more chance of explaining it to the people.
Yeah, congratulations to anyone that's made it to the end, because it's a big meaty podcast. This one, lots of information to suck up. Cool. All right, everyone. Thanks, Sam, our producer. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for everyone for listening. If you want to support us, go to oxybomb.com, hit the Patreon button, see what you think. We would appreciate it very much. All right. Bye-bye.